Good evening. Welcome. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the Center, National Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's keynote lecture by Elizabeth McHenry, which kicks off the first Triangle Book History Symposium. Elizabeth is a fellow here from 1998 to 99, and it's wonderful to have her back at the Center. I actually happened to be here when the Uber pulled up, and she literally sprinted to the front door. I think she was happy to be back at the Center, threw herself against the pane glass, and hugged the building, just as many of our fellows who will leave in just a few short weeks, not so long, will regret having to go. Paul Fife from the English department at NC State and others involved in organizing this event have put together a fascinating program of talks, tours, and other activities over the next 2 days that help shed light on the breadth of intriguing book history, research being conducted, the tremendous archival resources that have been assembled, and the remarkable quality of print-related artistry going on right now all across the Triangle. So on behalf of the National Humanities Center, I want to say how delighted we are to be involved in this effort, to have you with us this evening. I'll also pass along our welcome from Robert Newman, who's currently in New Mexico at the moment, speaking on the humanities somewhere in the desert. And if you would, please join me in thanking Paul Fife for making all of this possible. I'll welcome him to the introduction now.
Thank you all very much for coming out. My name is Paul Fife. I'm an associate professor in the English department at NC State University just down the road in Raleigh, and the happy convener of the Triangle Book History Symposium. I hesitate to say that first because that might mean I'd have to do it again next year, but that could be fun. Volunteers are also see me after the talk. I want to thank the National Humanities Center for its incredibly generous support, which also comes from the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship of Scholars in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia Libraries. The symposium means to identify and celebrate the diverse community of researchers, book artists, librarians, printers, students, and others here in the Triangle, all of whom are interested in critical and creative ways of understanding the book, whether as a material object, a text, or a cultural phenomenon. The symposium comprises talks as well as brief presentations, as well as trips out into the community to visit libraries, special exhibits, artist studios, and more. And I should say signups are still open. There are programs scattered around the tables. Feel free to take advantage of the wonderful offerings our volunteers are providing over the next couple of days. The symposium also aims to promote community with its theme, Communities of the Book, focusing our attention on the communal practices of books, texts, and written things of all sorts. And for this theme, there are few more talented and incisive scholars than our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Elizabeth McHenry. Dr. McHenry is an associate professor of English at New York University, where she explores U.S. and African American literature, culture, and intellectual history in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is known even more broadly for her groundbreaking archival research into African American literary communities with her book, Forgotten Readers: Recovering the Lost History of African American Literary Societies. This book challenges the ways the field of African American literary history is conceived. It challenges book history to look instead at the history of readers, to look beyond the book to other communal forms of textual exchange, and to look at the diverse, sometimes marginalized groups of Black Americans who have been overlooked, showing how they formed communities of readers to advance their changing historical goals. I am absolutely delighted that Dr. McHenry opens our symposium tonight with a glimpse of her ongoing work. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth McHenry.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I was hugging the building, just a little bit. I don't think I've ever had so much fun working so hard, and that was like 15 years ago, and I still remember it intensely fondly. So let me begin. The work I want to present to you tonight comes from my current project, which seeks to chronicle African American literary culture at the turn from the 19th century to the 20th. I came to look at this period to resolve the resounding silence that emanates from it. It's one of the most understudied, least understood moments in African American literary history. Historians have mined this interval for its political upheavals and rhetoric, documenting in particular the debates between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois for ideological leadership of the Black community. But literary scholars have, by and large, neglected it, maintaining their focus more comfortably on the easily recognizable authors, published works, and established publishing venues associated with the Harlem Renaissance, that cultural, social, and artistic explosion which took place in the 1920s. Scholarly preoccupation with conventional markers of literary achievement, major writers and well-known works of fiction, has left the turn of the century largely unreadable, offering the false sense that this period was unremarkable in African American literary history. My aim in making Negro literature is to grapple more fully with this largely unmapped moment by considering a series of genres, institutions, personalities, and conditions of authorship and publication that allow us to reflect on the period's distinctive situations of literary engagement for African Americans. These situations, some successful, others failed or only partially achieved, offer a crucial lens through which to capture the unsettledness of the category of Black literature at the beginning of the 20th century, even in the minds of those working in the field. My argument in making Negro literature is that these turn-of-the-century stories are a distinctive piece of African American literary history that has been overlooked. Organized not around prominent names and major works, but around a set of now unfamiliar and critically undervalued intellectual workspaces, this history has effectively evaded our attention, making it impossible for us to recognize the kinds of questions that motivated the period's literary projects and their practitioners at the very moment a modern understanding of African American literature and criticism was taking form. What was African American literature? How should it be defined and structured, and what were its proper parameters, practices, and objects of attention? How was authorship imagined and pursued? Through what venues would its writers come to be known, and how should its readership be organized and shaped? Here I'm building on a growing body of scholarship in African American print culture studies that attempts to complement, complicate, and challenge popular concepts about the ways in which African American literature has taken shape across the 19th and 20th centuries, in part by reconsidering received assumptions about what constitutes its relevant archives and objects of study. In the first chapter, I look at the genre of the anthology, sold door to door at Black households, particularly in the South, by subscription publishers at the turn of the century. I argue that these were designed to replicate the architectural space of the 1895 Atlanta Exposition's Negro building, the first designated space on the fairgrounds of a World's Fair for the exhibition of Negro progress and achievements. In the years after the Atlanta World's Fair, when the bricks and mortar building that housed the Negro exhibit had been emptied of its contents, literary anthologies became logical substitutes for that temporary exhibition, their textual forms offering the benefit of displays that did not have to be dismantled, but could enter people's homes on a permanent basis. Another chapter juxtaposes the authorship of two African American writers at the turn of the century, Booker T. Washington, who embraced the idea and impact of authorship and published many, many books under his name that he did not write, and T. Thomas Fortune, whose career as an important African American journalist has been recognized, but his frustrations as an author of his own texts, especially works of fiction, largely overlooked. Here I look at the fiction of Washington's authorship, perpetuated, I argue, at the cost of Fortune's own literary career. Fortune served as Washington's ghostwriter, effectively authoring all but one of his major publications, as his own career as a writer languished. In another chapter, I take on a body of unpublished short stories by Mary Church Terrell, a political figure who believed that imaginative literature generally, and the short story specifically, had the potential to speak to the race problem, articulating the lives and struggles of African Americans in ways that nonfiction and journalism could not. Her story is distinctly about an aspect of literary history that rarely receives critical attention, that of failure. Her archives at the Library of Congress are full of short stories she wrote and sought to have published in venues like Harper's Magazine, as well as a dispiriting series of rejection letters demonstrating that the political climate in which she found herself was unsupportive of her literary ambitions. But her failure is not irrelevant. I explore the ways Terrell used her fictional writing to wage a campaign against a publishing industry that refused to publish the works of African Americans, a campaign waged not for her own benefit, but with an eye toward opening up these avenues of publication for Black writers in the future. As I hope you can see from this brief overview, the book's chapters are meant to serve as a variety of portals that provide entry into the literary atmosphere of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Perhaps the most unfamiliar portal that I travel through in this book is that of bibliography, and it's about bibliography that I will speak to you today. I should begin by saying that I, like many of you, began this project with a very limited interest in bibliography. Constructing one is, of course, the somewhat tedious chore that serves as a final stage in the completion of scholarly books and articles, and it's a form of citation that we cajole our students into getting right, especially in terms of its exact formatting, as a part of the process of becoming scholars themselves. These are not the kind of bibliographies in which I'm interested here, or more accurately, this is not the only way I've come to think about bibliographies. As a genre, bibliography is not simply about listing books or making reference guides. Bibliography is by definition an organizational experimental genre, one used by its practitioners to assess, catalog, and characterize written texts in order to establish or declare the parameters of a literature and suggest a means of its organization. It's a genre that's at once documentary but also generative, listing books in a particular order by a particular system or under particular categorical headings as a way of establishing a scaffolding of ideas. Bibliographers do not author books, but they do author information and knowledge systems that form the basis of writing and rewriting narratives about different subjects and ideas. In this project, bibliographies emerge as one of the most interesting and historically important features of African American literary history, not because of how they are used today, but because of their meaning for the generation that created them. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these experimental knowledge structures gave purpose and legitimacy to Black literature and made possible the very act of reading it. Through bibliographies, Black intellectuals at the turn of the century quite literally found Black literature. Their bibliographies gave it shape, and in doing so, facilitated a growing reading public for Black letters. Thanks in part to my own Forgotten Readers, a history of African American readers and their organized literary activities between 1830 and 1940, critical inquiry into scenes of reading have become commonplace in literary scholarship. But prior to and less visible than these are systems of access used by readers to find texts and understand them as part of a larger field of knowledge. These literary practices resist critical appraisal. They are often used, but rarely read. And perhaps rightly so. I'm sure all of us in this room have passionately cited a beloved or conversely a hated text, but how many of us have been similarly moved by a bibliography? Traditionally, bibliographies serve as tools that we use to facilitate our scholarship. They are not themselves the subject of scholarly inquiry. But what if we were to linger on the fact and function of bibliographies, and in particular, on the emergence of a cluster of bibliographies on literature by colored authors, produced as the 19th century turned into the 20th by a series of African American intellectuals? These bibliographies were, I argue, at once a system of record keeping, a disciplining mechanism, and a way to wrest intellectual leadership out of the hands of those who would cast African Americans as an unintelligent people. The bibliographies I examine are actively involved in a collective effort to conceptualize and map out the scope of Black letters in an effort to establish a tradition. Following David Scott, at their heart is a practice of inauguration, at once conserving and a condition of critique, revision, and change. My interest in bibliographies began with the bibliography that is embedded in the anthology that I look at in the first chapter of my book, called Progress of a Race. Under the heading Colored Authors and Names of Publication, this bibliography includes 139 titles, listed alphabetically by author. Some of the titles are written by clergy and have to do with Negro religion, such as The Negro Baptist Pulpit or The Colored Man in the AME Church. But a clergyman, Bishop Arnett, was also the author of the essay Negro Literature, which had appeared in the AME Church Review in 1890 and included its own list of notable examples of the race's literary achievements, insisting that the religious leaders were not only responsible for writing about religion. W.E.B. Du Bois's recently published The Suppression of the African Slave Trade was included, as was the Afro-American Press and its editors by I. Garland Penn, who had served as the head commissioner of the Negro building at the Atlanta Exposition. All three of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies are listed, as are other texts pertaining to slavery, including William Still's The Underground Railroad and Reverend William Troy's Hairbreadth Escape from Slavery. Several texts, like the Reverend C.S. Smith's Glimpses of Africa and Alexander Crummel's Africa and America, reinforce Progress of a Race's determination to acknowledge in print the African past of the nation's Black people. The list also includes the celebrated Black poet Phillis Wheatley and the 19th century Black writer William Wells Brown, whose The Black Man, The Negro in the Rebellion, and The Rising Sun are included, but not the 1853 novel Clotel, for which he is most widely known today. Many of the Black women writers whose literary accomplishments in the 1890s had earned them substantial recognition were included, like Anna Julia Cooper, whose A Voice from the South had just been published, Victoria Earle, we know her as Victoria Earle Matthews, N.F. Massell, The Work of American Women, and Ida B. Wells's A Red Record. Although in an earlier chapter of the anthology, Frances Harper had been identified as one of the many political activists who should be included in any record of African American history, she's reintroduced in the bibliography as the author of 6 works of literature, including the novel Iola Leroy. Paul Loris Dunbar receives recognition as the author of Oak and Ivy and Negro Love Song. The genre of biography also finds a place on the list, with titles like Richard Allen's Place in History and The Honorable Frederick Douglass by J.M. Gregory. Finally, T. Thomas Fortune's Black and White, an analysis of racism as a systemic, institutionalized practice, published in 1884, is included, as is a collection of essays by William Krogman, the chief editor of the anthology in which the list appears. Like most of the entries in the anthology, the list of colored authors and names of publications is unsigned, and its authorship is unknown. Krogman was a professor of Latin and Greek at Clark University in Atlanta. Did he compile the bibliography? If so, what did he think would be the purpose of this list of colored authors and names of publication? How did he imagine that this collection of names and titles would be read and appreciated, and how would it be put to use? In isolation, the list seems modest at best, appearing as it does in just over 6 pages, tacked on to the very end of the chapter of Personages of the Negro Race. One function of the bibliography was certainly the enumeration of titles by African American writers, which alone announced and documented the existence of colored authors and underscored the quantity of literature they had produced. Readers of Progress of a Race might also have used the bibliography to inform their own future reading. The list would point them towards texts by Black writers and about Black subjects that would supplement their understanding of African American history and literature. These uses alone would make the bibliography a crucial part of Progress of a Race and a significant aspect of this editor's effort to intervene in debates about Black progress and, by extension, the future of the Negro in the United States. One way of looking at Krogman's modest list of colored authors and names of publication is as a map, necessarily preliminary and in process, of the landscape of Black letters. As such, the list, or bibliography, is an attempt to establish the boundaries and contours of Black literature and authorship, and in doing so, to grapple with the very idea of literary production by African Americans and the very definition of African American literature. What should it include? What should be excluded, and how should the bibliography be titled and arranged? These questions do not formally introduce the colored authors and names of publication section of Progress of a Race, but they are inherent in the very form of bibliography, a genre that, despite its seeming authority, also makes visible the instability or processes of development of a literary tradition. What is most important here is the very process in which the bibliographer engages. The bibliography created is an exploratory document. In the details of its composition, it attempts to frame the objects it includes and the subject matter it addresses, asking and answering important questions as a way of making a larger argument. It's telling then that this period is littered with bibliographies. Read in isolation, these documents are important as print artifacts of African-American authorship. But taken together, the key bibliographies published around the turn of the century emerge and cohere as modes of practical criticism. It's worthwhile to compare the bibliography in Progress of a Race, for instance, to a list compiled in 1894 by Roger Mara Adger, a Philadelphia-based African-American post office employee and collector of rare books and pamphlets by and about Black people. Adger's was not technically a bibliography, but he called it a partial catalog of works in his own collection, and the title was officially A Portion of a Catalog of Rare Books and Pamphlets upon subjects relating to the past condition of the colored race and the slavery agitation in this country. Born in 1837, Adger was deeply involved throughout his life in Philadelphia's social, literary, and political organizations that fostered abolition and African-American civil rights. As a member, and then after 1863, the president of the Banneker Institute, he had access to books and was accustomed to regular intellectual debate and discussion. His own desire not just to see or read objects having to do with Black history and culture, but to collect them, seems to have grown from the wealth of potential artifacts to which he was exposed. The list he compiled is alphabetized by title rather than author, and is notable for its variety in terms of both subject matter and format. Adger included books by Black authors like William Wells Brown's The Black Man and Joseph Thomas Wilson's The Black Phalanx. But these are the only authors that are included on both Adger's list and the list included in Progress of a Race. Unlike that bibliography, Adger's was focused not on identifying Negro authors or those texts produced by them, but rather highlighting the variety of historical records of slavery and abolition generally. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Dread is included, but not Uncle Tom's Cabin, as were two popular abolitionist gift books, Autographs for Freedom and The Liberty Bell, both of which were edited by whites. The list also includes objects made important by their associations, like A Discourse Before the Young Men's Colonization Society of Philadelphia, delivered in 1834. Finally, the catalog listed a number of prints and visual images, including a sketch of Thomas Clarkson, fine steel engravings of John Brown, and a large painting of Frederick Douglass. Now, there are many obvious differences between Adger's list and the bibliography included in Progress of a Race. The 1898 list of colored authors and names of publications, for instance, records exclusively textual offerings. But most notable is the list's confrontation of the distinction between a Black archive, consisting exclusively of productions of colored authors, and an archive of the subject of Blackness generally. Whereas Adger's list included objects broadly associated with the Black condition, the Progress of a Race bibliography is governed by its determination to compile a list of texts written exclusively by colored authors, leaving a larger archive of Blackness outside of the realm of Black print culture. It should be noted that Adger's catalog is limited to those texts that he had in his possession, most likely collected over years. Whereas the value of the bibliography in Progress of a Race was limited to its use value for readers interested in learning about Black authorship or augmenting their reading, Adger was a collector and also a dealer in rare books, and he wished to sell his collection. He says singly or whole. Through his list, we get a sense of the cash value of these works. Volume 1 of Stowe's Dread, for instance, was offered for 25 cents. While Sojourner Truth's narrative was 10 cents. Wilson's Black Phalanx is listed for $1.25, and Frederick Douglass's portrait was being sold for $20. But even with this caveat, Adger's bibliography marks a very different intellectual project than that of Progress of a Race, whose interest was in formulating the boundaries of Black writing as both an emergent category of literature and an embodied tradition of literary production. Daniel Murray's effort in 1900 to compile a bibliography of Negro authors can be seen as in keeping with this project. As an assistant at the Library of Congress, Murray was tasked with making a collection of books by Negro authors to form a part of the Negro exhibit at the Paris exhibition of 1900. Murray started with a list of works by Negro authors that had been included in the Bureau of Education's report of 1893 to 1894. 2 weeks after receiving his assignment and after adding to that list, Murray found out his own, what he called, preliminary list of books and pamphlets by Negro authors. This was accompanied by what he called a circular requesting, and I quote, the cooperation of men of literary knowledge in several cities. He knew that many more texts existed by reason of the imperfect recollection of individuals who said they had seen or heard of a book written and published by a colored author, and that copies had been in circulation in their neighborhood years ago. And he was determined to test and trace to a finality every rumor or inkling in this regard. The circular was meant to acquaint the public with the purpose of this library, and that's the Library of Congress, to compile a bibliography of all books and pamphlets which colored authors had at any time published, he said. My dear sir, said the circular, the Librarian of Congress has undertaken to cooperate in the work of making a collection of books by Negro authors to form a part of the Negro exhibit at the Paris exhibition of 1900, and has detailed the undersigned, that's Daniel Murray, to take charge of the same, he wrote, clearly articulating his understanding of the importance of this display on the world stage and for the development of Black literary and intellectual history. He went on, I need not dilate upon the importance of having such an exhibit at Paris and the value of such a collection to future investigators of the bibliography of Negro authorship, etc., he said. To ensure that his mission received as wide a distribution as possible, he asked each one receiving the circular information to secure its publication in the local newspaper. At the close of the exhibition, he wrote, the whole collection will be installed in the magnificent Library of Congress to be on exhibit and for consultation for all time. Murray was confident that a work appealing so strongly to every colored man and woman in the land would enlist their active cooperation. To this end, he first sent copies of the preliminary list and the circular and a prepaid return envelope for any copies of the book that people would send to the 180 educational institutions devoted to Negro youth located in the South. The response he received from these institutions was unexpected. From the whole number, 12 answers were received, a full 5 of these from white men presiding over colored schools, Murray reported to his supervisor at the Library of Congress, David Hutchinson, in a lengthy letter written at the completion of the project in October of 1900. After a month's effort and fully 1,000 circulars sent out, I was rather discouraged and disappointed, he wrote. I had pictured the race eager, anxious, and appreciative of such a golden opportunity. Certainly, one might be justified in supposing that when an opportunity presents itself to put in evidence that the Negro race possessed high intellectual capacity and had produced literary works of an exalted character, the opportunity for such proof would have been eagerly seized. Either there had been a general misapprehension of what was sought, Murray concluded, or a lack of definitiveness in the method of disseminating the information through the circulars sent out. But despite this frustration, Murray was pleased with the large number of unsolicited letters he received, proffering books and pamphlets and information in regard to the same. Murray took at least 2 trips out of Washington to find material by Black authors, and this yielded what he called the most gratifying results, so much so that he became convinced that success lay in the personal appeal. So he wrote with his own hand and sent out 4,000 personal letters, each worded in a form to suit the case at hand. His personal communications went to distinguished bookmen, such as Wilberforce Eames of the Lenox Library, later to become part of the New York Public Library. By March of 1900, Eames sent out 54 titles that Murray added to his list. Murray also wrote to Edmund Barton, the American Antiquarian Society's head librarian, to appeal for that institution's support. No doubt many rare pamphlets are now in the collection of your society, and it is to have a list of them for bibliographic purposes that I address you, Murray wrote. His hope was that Barton would scour the Society's collection for titles he could add to his list and also solicit titles informally from African Americans residing in the local community. Murray also requested that Barton send him copies of any text he had available or could secure. I enclose penalty envelope for your reply, Murray optimistically added to Barton's letter, and labels for any package you could collect from your duplicates or from some colored people in your community. No records remain to indicate whether Barton was able to successfully solicit titles or texts from Worcester's African-American community. But he supplied Murray with Benjamin Banneker and Phyllis Wheatley titles and many very helpful suggestions. So let me pause here for a second and just say that Murray had been had been an assistant at the Library of Congress for about 20 years before he started this project, and he was well versed in the kind of bibliographic materials and projects that were ongoing at the library, particularly under the director who was just before the person Putnam, who took over in 1899. And so he made up these circulars which detailed all the information he wanted. And so it's author, title, size of the book, place of publication, name of publisher, date of title on title page, and he added in his own print number of pages, and edition is at the bottom. So you'll see what he received back had as much information as people knew. And even though he preferred this very official way of reporting text, what you see over the course of researching his project and putting together the bibliography is that titles came in every which way. And so this is an envelope with his name on the front, and the back side is just simply a list of titles of works authored by African Americans. As you can see, although my work in this project is to read bibliographies, Murray's process of assembling the 1900 bibliography is fascinating. It enabled him to make critical observations about African American writing and crucial interventions into its realization as a body of literature. One thing he noted was the geographical distribution of African American literary materials, which were related to patterns of the development of Black print culture. In Philadelphia, he reported, can be found more of the early books and pamphlets of this class of author than any other place. And this is actually a list of titles sent by an African-American leader named Jacob C. White. And you can see there's no cordiality or greetings in this. This is just all texts by Negro authors. As he located sites of Black textuality, he identified those collections that were ripe to be brought together in literary repositories. The University of Pennsylvania, he noted, had received by bequest the valuable collection of Mr. Robert Purvis. But the collection of Mr. Jacob C. White will probably come to this library, the Library of Congress, if his express intention is carried out. Because Murray could promise that the collection had a future after the Paris Exposition in the Library of Congress as part of its permanent collection, where it would be available for consultation for all time, donors were themselves more willing to contribute. As a federal institution, the library had no racial restrictions on admission, leaving these texts at least potentially available to Black readers in a way they would certainly not be in a segregated library. In fact, Murray's project laid the groundwork for some key acquisitions. Several parties who had collections of very rare books and pamphlets by Negro authors, he noted in his final report, have expressed a willingness to present them to the Library of Congress. The library itself was clearly committed to the project and to the inclusion of literature by African Americans in their collection. It was, in fact, the helpful interest by suggestions shown by Mr. Putnam, who, again, was the new head of the Library of Congress, who assumed his post in 1899, determined to improve library services and support research, that gave Murray confidence that the collection would indeed be valued and find a permanent home at the library. Indeed, upon the suggestion of Mr. Putnam, the process of cataloging the books was already underway. Mr. Hansen of the catalog department has made a classified catalog of the several subjects represented by the 980 titles in hand by March 31st, 1900, Murray wrote in his report. The library's support for the preservation of these materials was also demonstrated. Murray was provided with the means to rebind and repair all books needing such attention, and over 60 books and about 175 pamphlets were repaired or bound as part of the preparations for the 1900 exhibit. So in the end, the exhibit in Paris included 980 titles. And this is a picture of the exhibit. What is the most familiar part of the exhibit is actually the photographs that Du Bois didn't take, but presented as part of the exhibit. And they were mostly from across the South and came from institutions also like Hampton. But the books you can see on the shelf below, and the panels you can see hanging sort of accordion fashion on the third level under the portraits. Murray described their arrangement this way. The 980 titles were arranged under the subject headings on 16 large sheets, 18 by 24, encased in a frame under glass, and attached by hinges to a stationary post. Among the subject headings included were books on education, fiction, social sciences and arts, reading, and travels. We are left, however, with no specific record of what was included in the set of 980 titles in the glass encased sheets. And the irony of Murray's effort is that it is easier to see the trajectory of his efforts to put together the list of Negro authors than it is to see the exact parameters of the final bibliography he assembled. Perhaps this is fitting, as Murray seemed unable or unwilling to stop adding to the list. By the end of the summer of 1900, only 8 months into the project, Murray had gathered the necessary data to establish fully 1,400 titles. What we do have, however, is rich with information about how Murray thought about what he considered a burgeoning field of inquiry into Negro authors and their writing. Murray's preliminary list of books and pamphlets by Negro authors is organized alphabetically by author. Its formatting includes 3 columns, one for the author, one for its title, and one for its place and date of publication. This last column is often left blank, indicating that this information, although desirable, remained a mystery. This and other holes in the bibliography, coupled with Murray's general sense of the status of the bibliography, incomplete and constantly in need of revision, ever on the way to fulfilling his objective to one day compose a complete Negro bibliography, effectively underscores the way in which bibliography as a genre served as an important intellectual workspace at the turn of the century. Murray's bibliography offered a scaffold on which to think about Negro authorship and to conceptualize the very idea of Negro literature. The bibliography included Ida D. Bailey's Atlanta Souvenir Cookbook, published in 1895, as well as Margaret Brown's French Cookbook, published in 1886, and compellingly described by the author in the preface as dictated by me and carefully written down by my friend, Louise A. Smith. These appear alongside texts that remain well known to scholars of African American literary history, such as Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave and Linda Brent's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, a text which is listed under the name of its fictional persona rather than its author, Harriet Jacobs, even though Murray was aware of the identity of the author, having received a copy of the narrative from Cornelia Grinnell Willis, who had purchased Jacob's freedom around 1852, along with, and in her letter, she explained the narrative's genesis. William Wells Brown's Clotel appears on Murray's list, but in its final 1867 edition, which was published in Boston. Neither the novel's original publication as Clotel, published in London in 1853, nor its repackaged 1861 version, titled Meralda, which had been serialized weekly in the Anglo-African magazine in 1860, nor its 1864 version, published as a dime novel in a series marketed to Union soldiers, is listed. Curiously, while Charles Chestnut is included as the author of the short story The Wife of His Youth, which was published in the Atlantic magazine in 1898, and the story collection The Conjure Woman, which was published in 1899 by Houghton Mifflin, Murray identified neither text by date or place of publication. It's also interesting to note that Murray's 1900 preliminary bibliography adds to the corpus of African American literature a number of texts we now consider of crucial importance to both African American and American literature broadly conceived, including David Walker's Appeal and Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition Address. Equally interesting is his inclusion at the very end of the bibliography of two texts that he identifies as anonymous. The two texts are titled Joshua and 50 Years. There's an argument inherent in the decision to include these texts without knowing who exactly authored them, not only about the difficulty of recovering the African American past, particularly given its sparse traces and its erasure from the very sorts of documentary traditions in which Murray worked, but also about the necessity of doing so, even if it resulted in a record of African American writing that remained incomplete. There are certainly questions that can be asked about Murray's methods and about the texts he included on his list. In at least one instance, Murray appealed to his friend George Myers, asking him if he had, and I quote, "some printed pamphlet bearing your name that I can have so as to include your name in the bibliography. If it's a campaign pamphlet or issued in your name, that will give me something." Myers was indeed an important, if now almost entirely unrecognized, political writer and intellectual, but this request raises the question of whether Murray grew so interested in expanding the list that he was willing to pad it with material published by his friends. On the other hand, Murray's desire to include writing by Myers suggests his shifting ideas about just what he was doing with the list. In the same letter to Myers, he revealed his own personal goals for the bibliography, which had now taken on a life of its own beyond the Paris Exposition display. He wished to write a book that would give the world a history of Negro literature. This book became the root of Murray's ambitious and forever unpublished encyclopedia project, many partial drafts of which can be found in Murray's papers in the Library of Congress. Murray's title for the work, A Bibliography of Negro Literature, already suggests a sizable distance from the preliminary bibliography's focus on assembling a set of books and pamphlets by Negro authors. And although it is unclear exactly when Murray made the semantic and conceptual shift from Negro authorship to Negro literature, it seems apparent that in the very process of assembling books and pamphlets by Negro authors, he came to want to speak in narrative terms to its historic, artistic, and intellectual value as a literature. It's unclear how his adaptation of the word literature might have retrospectively affected the shape or scope of his preliminary list had he returned to revise it. Would either Ida D. Bailey's Atlanta Souvenir Cookbook or Margaret Brown's French Cookbook, for instance, have remained on a list of Negro literature? Murray's list of books and the books on display in Paris were celebrated as perhaps the most unique and striking part of the exhibition of American Negroes. W.E.B. Du Bois, in proclaiming the importance of these texts, said, "Here is a bibliography made by the Library of Congress containing 980 titles written by Negroes. 200 of these books are displayed on the shelves." Du Bois's enthusiasm for the exhibit and for Murray's accomplishment is documented here. But his own 1900 bibliography is suggestive of the different ways he used the genre in an experimental but generative way to critique and revise the avenues through which the Negro could be approached through print. Du Bois taught history and the then new discipline of sociology at Atlanta University from 1897 to 1910. One of his chief responsibilities was directing the Atlanta University Studies, a program inaugurated in 1896 by University President Horace Bumstead in an effort to study carefully and thoroughly certain definite aspects of the Negro problem. The Atlanta University Studies resulted in annual conferences and publications from 1896 to 1914. Bibliographies were included in these publications in the years 1900, 1901, and 1905. But the bibliography included in the proceedings of the 5th annual conference, titled The College-Bred Negro, and published in 1900, is perhaps the most interesting to look at for our purposes as it corresponds chronologically to Murray's bibliography for the Paris Exposition. A selected bibliography of the American Negro for general readers is in essence a part of the College-Bred Negro's introduction. And one of the biggest questions about the bibliography is raised by its very title. Who were, in Du Bois's mind, the general readers toward whom the bibliography was aimed? The Atlanta University studies were reviewed in many periodicals that would have primarily reached white readers. In 1903, for instance, they were heralded by Outlook magazine, which wrote that no student of the race problem, no person who would either think or speak on it intelligently can afford to be ignorant of the facts brought out in the Atlanta series. But the studies, printed in pamphlet form, were also likely to have been read by African Americans eager to learn about the advancements of their race. My sense is that the best way to think of this bibliography is as geared to the segment of the population, black or white, who would have been genuinely interested in learning more about African Americans and sympathetic to Du Bois's overall project in the Atlanta University studies, which was to throw as much light as possible on the intricate social problems affecting the masses for the enlightenment of its graduates, and by that it meant the graduates of Atlanta University and of the general public. It's worth noting that the project employed a secretary to furnish correspondents with information upon any phase of the Negro problem as far as he is able, and to point out such sources as exist from which accurate data may be obtained. Yearly, requests for information on the Negro would be addressed to this secretary from sources as wide as the United States government, professors in northern and southern institutions, students of sociology, philanthropic societies and workers, and many private persons. From 1899 to 1900, the list of those requesting information ranged from the black intellectuals who made up the membership of the American Negro Academy to students from largely white institutions like Harvard, Columbia, Catholic University, the University of Chicago, Wellesley College, and the University of Texas. Just as the pamphlets and other print materials used by the Atlanta University studies were meant to serve as educational resources on the Negro problem then, the bibliography for general readers was meant to function the same way. Here, Du Bois is not focused on black authorship, but mixes texts written by black and white authors without identifying them racially. The bibliography is quite informal. With few exceptions, entries are limited to authors' last names and the titles of works, suggesting that Du Bois had confidence his general reader, interested in finding these books or placing them historically or chronologically, would be able to track down publication details for him or herself. What that general reader did need, Du Bois makes clear in the structure of his bibliography, was guidance of an intellectual type. The list of pertinent titles was broken down by specific focus as well as by genre. Sections included history, present social conditions, biography, literature and art, and bibliography, methods of study, etc. The section on history is helpfully divided further into subsections that specify several historical subjects black readers might wish to better understand, be it the history of the Negro generally, slave codes, the character of slavery, the economics of slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, or the history of Negro soldiers. What is perhaps most interesting here is the way that Du Bois insists on the complexity of black history by asserting that, as a classification, it demands subsections. All texts on the Negro problem, he insists, were not the same. Understanding the Negro and Negro history warranted complex delineation. The structure of Du Bois's bibliography insisted that there were multiple means through which to access black history and began the process of distinguishing them. The effect here may seem trivial, but in bibliographies, like in libraries, a certain vision of the world is imposed upon the reader through its categories. Classification in this case reflected Du Bois's wish to influence the known world of the Negro by insisting that there was not one authorized point of entry for inquiry into it, but many. In this, Du Bois disrupted readers' assumptions about the nature of the Negro and his history. In insisting that they see the complexity of Negro history, his means of organizing the bibliography also foretold the kinds of questions they would ask of the history of African Americans in the US. Although he introduces the bibliography simplistically as a list of what he calls the best literature extant on the Negro problems, the bibliography itself complicates by differentiating those categories through which Negro history might be explored. In doing so, he reframes the Negro problem into something much more complex than acknowledged by most turn-of-the-century filing systems, and one might say much more complex than that simple phrase, the Negro problem. The history of slavery, he insists, was not a single universal story. His arrangement of the materials in the bibliography instead makes the argument that studying it required nuanced analysis, as it was deeply intertwined with questions of legal maneuvers, economics, and empire. Another important assertion Du Bois makes in this bibliography lies in the fact that his section on history includes a significant number of genres not traditionally associated with the telling of history. As I mentioned earlier, Du Bois does divide the bibliography by genre, separating periodical literature, for instance, from biography, from literature and art, which itself had subcategories: folklore, music, and literature. But within the category of history, subsection character of slavery, he includes Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Albion Torgie's A Fool's Errand. It is included in a subsection on Reconstruction. These fictional narratives certainly address sectional and racial problems, but their dramatic nature might exclude them from many critics' understanding of the materials appropriate for communicating the historical past. Also included in his history books are biographies and autobiographies, including The Life of Garrison, written by his children, and William Higginson's Life in a Black Regiment, a series of first-person accounts of his experience leading the first colored troops in the Civil War. These choices suggest that Du Bois saw opportunities in the genres of fiction and life writing, for instance, as a means of relating the past and informing or expanding its analysis. Scholars have questioned these genres as insufficiently rigorous to document history. But Du Bois might be seen here as expanding the boundaries of historical writing and of what counts as historical evidence, critiquing the idea that traditional narrative history alone provides sufficient insight into historical events or human emotion to tell the story of the Black past. The list of texts that Du Bois includes mounts an argument for the complexity that fiction and autobiography contribute as components of sound historical analysis, perhaps particularly for historical subjects and actors that have been marginalized. The section of the bibliography on present social condition is a list of 20 numbered texts and is followed by a systematic breakdown of the text into various subjects. If readers were interested in books on health and mortality, for instance, they were directed to look at the following numbers: number 4, 6a, 7, 8, 10, and 18. Du Bois's recommended set of texts on amalgamation included number 1, which was the US Census and included both the 1860 and 1890 reports. Number 3, 6b, 10, and 16. Taken together, each of these numerical clusters represented courses of study intended to address and inform readers on different aspects of the so-called Negro problem. Students of these numerical lists were invited to teach themselves Black history, the orchestrated reading guides a part of Du Bois's larger agenda to educate Blacks and whites alike in how best to inform themselves about African Americans and racial politics. These texts could be approached by suggested subject matters, but they could also be approached through more general courses of reading, which Du Bois also lays out in the bibliography. A short course of reading included 7 texts. For those with more time and interest, a longer course of reading was also included, which in addition to Williams' History of the Negro Race in America, included 11 other texts selected from across the present social condition section of the bibliography. It's telling that Du Bois's bibliography ends with the category of bibliography, methods of study, etc., a section which at first glance appears unremarkable, but given the subject of my study, suggests Du Bois' own conviction of the importance of source documents for Black readers and warrants further inquiry. When considered in conjunction with Adger's collection of items relating to the past condition of the colored race, Progress of a Race's list of colored authors from 1898, Murray's list of Negro authors from 1900, Du Bois's effort here falls into place as a part of a complicated imperative to sort through, order, and present Black print culture and the category of Black authorship in Negro literature, and to consider their relationship to Black history and other valued elements of culture. In making visible how structures of knowledge and categories of thought were arranged, considered, and rearranged, these texts have much to tell us about how African American literature and authorship and the subject of Blackness was being mapped, aesthetically imagined, and politically mobilized. In closing, let me note that the intellectual work of making Negro literature that becomes visible in these bibliographies is mirrored in the larger unsettledness of literature as a category in the US at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. Institutional histories of the professionalization of literary studies tell us that at this moment, the study of literature was consolidating as a formal practice, and English as a discipline was taking shape. The literary education provided by traditional colleges, where literary study was largely conceived of as an extension of grammar, rhetoric, and elocution, was giving way to the democratic modern university sense that literature itself could and should be organized and taught. But how? As pre-academic literary culture, think drawing rooms, literary societies, and public oratorical performances, gave way to academic literary culture, African Americans joined other intellectuals in the US to imagine, develop, and debate particular scholarly and critical practices. At the heart of African American bibliographies are the same fundamental concerns being discussed and debated in a number of forums across the nation. What are the branches of knowledge that should be taken up? What are the parameters of literature and literary practice? How should literature be organized? What might a literary curriculum look like, and what vocabulary of terms should it use? How should a tradition of humanism and cultural tradition be considered, and how should it be taught? What are the new branches of knowledge, and how should they be harmonized with the old? African American bibliographies frame and debate these questions, laying the groundwork for thinking critically about African American literature and making visible the participation of African Americans in ongoing conversations about the construction of literature as a category, the proper objects of attention within the category of literature, and the value of literature and literary study. Thank you.